Spence has told us multiple times he feels that a huge fight could happen between himself and Canelo in Dallas at the big stadium. He'd be doing the same thing, moving up 2 weight classes to fight Canelo. Would there be interest on your part to make that fight happen? And you think the time is right for a fight like that to happen?
Absolutely. Canelo is always willing and ready to face the very best. And I believe that Errol Spence can come up a couple weight divisions and challenge a fighter like Canelo, and that'll be a super fight. But you have to come and talk to us because we would know how to stage that type of event. We would really make that a super event with Canelo and Spence. But obviously, first thing is first. Look, Spence has his plans, and Canelo we have our plans. So we'll see what happens in the future. But I'm hoping that I get that knock on the door from Spence that one day he wants to be involved in a major pay-per-view.
I was asked by Aunt Muga, shout out to Aunt Muga, what my preliminary thoughts are for a potential Canelo Alvarez versus Errol Spence fight. What do I think about that fight? What would the mechanics of that fight be? And who would I favor to win that fight if that fight were in the near future? You know, anybody that watches this sport enough knows the importance of timing. Not just inside of the ring when punches are being thrown, but the timing it takes for a fight to be created. That the timing at which a contest takes place can be a pretty big determining factor in who the victor will be. So understand that if we're talking about an Errol Spence versus Canelo Alvarez fight right here, right now, it's presumably somewhere in the near future. You know, somewhere far down the line, a lot of things could happen that would change your mind as far as who's going to win the fight. You know, guy might start taking losses. Guy might start to show he's on the slide. He's in decline. Could be a lot of different things if it's far down the line. So if we're even having this conversation, it's on the premise that this fight is close. You know, maybe 2-3 fights from now, something like that. So we'll have that conversation on the premise that Errol Spence and Canelo Alvarez were to hypothetically fight sometime in the near future. What do I think would happen if Canelo Alvarez and Errol Spence fought sometime in the near future? You know, the weight at which the contest takes place is just as important as the timing of the contest. If the contest were, a junior middleweight contest, 154, if Canelo were still hovering around that weight, it could actually be a bit competitive. It could. But we know that Canelo Alvarez is at 160 right now. And we also know that, well, he's the marquee fighter in this situation. He's the A-side. So he'd likely get his way. Which means if Canelo wants it to be a middleweight contest, that's likely what it would be. Just, same situation as the Khan situation. And Canelo's at middleweight right now. Except when he fought Amir Khan, that was at 155. Whereas this contest would presumably be at the limit, at 160. Errol Spence would have to make that climb to the middleweight division. I think it's likely that if these guys were to fight, it would be a full-fledged middleweight contest. In that way, it does favor Canelo. Because Errol Spence hasn't done Bo fucking diddly at 160. Hell, he hasn't done Bo fucking diddly at 154, much less 160. So that already kind of tilts the scales for Canelo, who in that situation would be the more experienced fighter at the weight. You think about both fighters respectively. Neither one of these fighters are on the slide. These are both young guys. Canelo's a young guy, Errol's a young guy. But what's the difference here? As a professional, Canelo Alvarez is more experienced than Errol. Canelo Alvarez has fought more different kinds of world-level opponents in some situations that, quite honestly, were opportunistic, but the same applies. That Canelo has seen more world-level opponents. He's been in there with more world-level opponents than Errol. Errol is, in a lot of ways, still making his bones, you understand. The crown jewel on his resume is Kell Brook, and we've often talked about what Kell Brook was coming from. But if we're looking for, who's going to get the edge in experience, who's had to deal with a lot more different kinds of situations in this fight, well, that would also go to Canelo. And since neither one of these guys is an old guy or something like that, you can skip the wear and tear argument, you understand? You can skip the argument where, maybe this guy's been in one too many fights or something like that.
Guys are young.
Maybe this guy's punch resistance is it's out of whack from getting hit hard too many times.
Not these guys.
You gotta bear in mind that this entire hypothetical situation is on the premise that Canelo makes it past Golovkin, that he succeeds, that he wins that fight, and that an Errol Spence fight follows subsequently thereafter. This is all on the premise that Canelo doesn't lose in the next couple of weeks. So if Canelo doesn't lose in the next couple of weeks, and somewhere down the line, in the near future, an Errol Spence fight gets made, well, you gotta realize that would be saying that Canelo Alvarez took out the boogeyman of the middleweight division. A far bigger puncher than Errol Spence. A far more experienced fighter than Errol Spence. This is the premise that we're operating under, that Canelo wins in September and Errol and him fight at some point. So you've got to factor that into the equation, that experience would have to go to Canelo. And not just experience overall, but experience at the weight, which would likely be a middleweight contest. Now, experience in this scenario is actually pretty important, because not only is Canelo the more experienced guy in the fight, who's dealt with southpaws before, at least once or twice,
Labra and Trout.
but his style. It doesn't really do Errol Spence any favors. You gotta think about the mechanics of this fight, the nuts and bolts of the fight. That Errol Spence at 147 is a very aggressive southpaw who's pretty polished boxer and has an inclination towards body punching. How does that play out against a naturally bigger guy who's more experienced, may have the edge in speed, and may also have the edge in power and punch resistance? And I hate to say this because I actually like Errol Spence. I think he's a good fighter. I think he has what it takes to at some point grace my own pound-for-pound list because he's not there today. But if he were to go up there in the near future for Canelo, I think he loses, and I think he loses bad. Canelo Alvarez's counter-punching style, his upper body movement, his angles at which he operates, these things would not do Errol Spence any favors, and this is a far cry from anyone he's faced so far. I mean, not only are you fighting a skillful fighter, say what you want about Canelo, I often do, but what we can't deny is that the kid can box. He can box. And quite honestly, Errol hasn't had the opportunity to fight someone like Canelo Alvarez. Errol hasn't had the opportunity yet to really face the best of his own weight class. So what kind of odds can you give him to go to 160 and face one of the elite guys that are up there? This ain't Chris Algieri we're talking about. This ain't Chris Algieri, this ain't Lamont Peterson, and this is not Kell Brook. We're talking about Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez's upper body movement, his ability to fight in the pocket and fire off the counters, those things are more than enough to dispatch Errol Spence inside of 2 to 3 fights. Then you think about the fact that, Errol Spence is a southpaw, he's a crafty southpaw, he's a hard-punching southpaw, but he is all these things at 147.
Not at 160.
And what do we know about southpaws? We know that a good way to hurt a southpaw, what is dubbed by some as the southpaw killer, is the straight right hand. Canelo Alvarez just so happens to have a pretty good straight right hand. So what do you imagine happens if Canelo Alvarez connects that right hand on Errol Spence the same way that he connected it against Austin Trout
Way back when.
in their unification fight? What do you think happens to Spence if Canelo lands a right hand just like that one? You know what I see? I see that Errol Spence might get touched by a guy who's a harder puncher than anybody he's fought. A harder puncher who's better defensively, better in the pocket, quicker hands. I see that Errol Spence might be a fish out of water in a Canelo Alvarez fight if the fight is inside of 2 to 3 fights. I do not give Errol Spence very good odds to win that fight, and I see that there are a lot of guys out there. They got a lot of illusions about Errol Spence. Delusions almost. Because he has yet to really, fight the very best of the welterweight division. Whether it's his fault or not is besides the point, because the point is, it really hasn't happened for him yet. He hasn't had the opportunity to fight the Thurmans and the Garcias and the Porters and the Crawfords of the division. And those fights happening, they're kind of important because those fights are the litmus test, not necessarily for what he can do at the welterweight division, but what he can do above the welterweight division. That if you're able to beat the best guys in your own weight class, there's a good chance that you'll do very well for yourself in the next weight class. But Errol hasn't had the chance to do that yet. So how could you give him very good odds to beat Canelo or even last with Canelo? When Canelo, say what you want, I often do, but the kid is experienced. He will be the bigger puncher in the fight. He'll likely also be the faster fighter in the fight with the faster hands and the better defense. Yet another area that may be troubling, at least, it's troubling for me, is that every so often I still see Errol Spence getting hit with punches that he really doesn't need to get hit. Some people interpret it as, well, he allows those punches to get through because he's trying to land power shots. Be that as it may, if that were Canelo Alvarez landing those punches, he wouldn't take them as well as he does. You can sit there and let Lamont Peterson plant one on you, but if you do that with Canelo, you're gonna get hurt because that guy's acclimated to that weight and you're not. Those are the facts. I mean, we're talking about a guy who not only would have a stylistic advantage, which helps, but would also have a physical advantage. Canelo would have everything working for him in this fight. He wouldn't even be out of his element. I mean, how long has Canelo Alvarez been fighting guys from lower weight classes, from Kermit Cintron to Josecito Lopez to Amir Khan? Canelo wouldn't be out of his element at all in this fight. He would have every advantage, physically, stylistically, and the intangibles. That Canelo is the marquee fighter in the fight, he is the A-side, so everything would be working for Canelo in this scenario. And then there's Errol Spence's level of experience as a pro that, you know what? Errol's a good fighter right now, and he might be a monster puncher at 147. He might be. But you may not be a monster puncher at 154, and you may be even less of a monster puncher at 160. So put your delusions away, kids. Errol Spence does not need to have this fight right now, and I don't think he should, regardless of the rewards. Of course, Oscar's gonna say, yeah, it's the right time for that fight, because it favors Canelo. Canelo would have every conceivable advantage in that fight. He'd be right in his element fighting another guy from a lower weight class. Whereas Errol has fought who and done what to prepare for this. You guys are telling yourselves that he spars the Charlo brothers. That's sparring, okay? Sparring is at a different intensity than the actual fight. The actual fight is completely different from what you're doing in preparation during camp, okay? This ain't a sparring session we're talking about. Canelo Alvarez has shown with some solid fighters in the junior middleweight division that he can still plant some really hard shots on a guy who's a moving target. Guys who aren't even as aggressive as Errol Spence. But if Errol Spence gets on that front foot and he tries to bring the fight to Canelo, oh, well, you're just making it easier for him to knock you out. He doesn't really have to find you because you're bringing yourself to him. You're bringing the fight to him. And that allows him to work off the counter, which is an area that he's very good at. I'll tell you the truth, I don't think Errol Spence should even want that fight right now. I think he's courting disaster in all the same ways that Mikey Garcia's courting disaster by calling him out. I think that these broad jumps, behind the incentive of a pay-per-view fight, the rewards associated with a fight, I think that these kinds of jumps derail careers. We see what it did to Brook, we see what it did to Khan, and we see what it did to Rigo. That would be a setback that would take some time to bounce back from. I don't think people would hold it against Errol that he couldn't beat a guy from 2 divisions up, but the damage that you sustain from that fight, it could be altering. It could have a long-lasting effect. So I don't think Errol should look at that fight. I don't think he should want that fight,
Walk away from there, okay?
I mean, I know that there are rewards attached to it because, well, both of these guys, especially in Texas, they got a big following. It could be a big event. But once the first bell rings, you're going to see that Errol Spence doesn't belong in that ring with Canelo. Not right now. So at the request of Aunt Mugga, you wanted my preliminary thoughts on this fight. I'm going to be honest. If Canelo Alvarez makes his way past Gennady Golovkin, and then he fights Errol Spence sometime in the near future, Spence loses. He loses bad. He loses real bad. Okay? You don't go from Kell Brook to Lamont Peterson to Carlos Ocampo all at 147. You don't go from that to Canelo Alvarez. Pay-per-view or no pay-per-view, incentive or no incentive, I think it's a bad idea. I think that could be Errol Spence's first professional loss if he decides to go that route. I would advise against it. Oh, he'd make a lot of coin. He'd make some money. He definitely would. But he'd lose. And it might be a loss that he needs time to bounce back from. So I'm not a proponent of that fight. I don't think he should have that fight. Stick to 147. Stick to what you know. Build your resume. Build your legacy. Fight who you gotta fight down there, so that you can move up in weight gradually the way that you're supposed to. Because these broad leaps, 9 times out of 10, you're courting disaster.